If you have your worksheets, go ahead and open those up to lesson 7. I, I didn't necessarily finish lesson 6, but I finished lesson 6, if that makes sense. We didn't necessarily talk about every detail within that lesson, but I feel like we covered the thought and intent of that lesson pretty intently. So we should be able to move on this evening and continue our study. And really, there's a principle within this lesson that I think we need to appreciate, that we've already kind of been talking about in some senses, if it relates to surrendering our lives to Jesus and doing that in better ways. And we've talked a lot over the last couple of weeks about making sure we get things in the right order. That it may seem like it's not that big a deal or not that important to think about things in those ways, but I think we found that as we've worked through these studies, that it is important for us to think about when and how certain things work together, but in which order do they occur. And that, I believe, is going to be essential in our conversation tonight, because he turns his attention about we should surrender over to Jesus and become what? More holy, right? We're talking tonight in this lesson about the idea of holiness. Sanctification is another word that comes up when it comes to this. The idea of being set apart or serving God in a manner that is holy. And as we work through this, I want us to notice again the concept of in what order or why should I want to be holy? Why is it? And we'll answer that as we go here in a minute. But why is it? Keep that in your back of your mind. Why is it that I should be holy? What's motivating that? What's the reason behind it? And have I maybe even reversed how all that works in my personal walk? Now, notice he gives an illustration. If you look at the worksheets for just a moment, he uses an illustrative method to try to give us a concept, a little bit of a concept, if you will, of what holiness is. And he basically talks about individuals who may want to purchase something, but they don't have the money right in the moment. And so what they do is they start putting money aside, and they're committed to that, and they stay focused on keeping that budget, if you will, and making sure that they don't use any of those funds because they're committed to a particular purpose. Holiness, in a sense, is the idea of being committed to a particular purpose. When it relates to God, then it's the idea of being committed to the purpose of honoring, worshiping, serving, and being the kind of child of God that He would desire from all of us. I want to start in Titus chapter 2. We're going to look pretty exclusively at 1 Peter 1 here in just a little while, but I want you to stop for a moment and look at Titus chapter 2, and in verse 11, because here's the initial point that I think we need to get before we can ever talk about my personal holiness and how I can strive to honor the will and purposes of God, to live a holy life. We need to kind of grasp this concept first. So he says, verse 11, Titus chapter 2, "For the grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared to all men." So let's stop for a second, not to insult your intelligence at all. But what did he just say is being brought? What's being brought? Yeah, okay. So I'm asking that weird. I get it. So what's being brought is salvation. What is it being brought through? Grace. So what's being offered or brought is salvation, and it is being brought for the grace of God. The grace of God is what's bringing salvation, and it's appeared to whom? It's appeared to all men. And what does it do in verse 12? Okay, so it teaches us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. Those things, in the latter part or through the end of verse 12 there, that are highlighted on the screen if you're looking at it, those things we would kind of say that's the conduct or character of one trying to be what? Holy. Trying to be holy. Not in order to receive grace, but they are that because they have already received grace. Now, again, you may say, well, Brian, there's a major difference, I believe, in the manner in which we adjust and make choices and decisions We are not striving for holiness so that I'll deserve grace. You can't deserve grace, right? You can't earn it, merit it. It's not warranted. You're not gonna, grace and salvation are not a merit badge that you've earned by a life of what are defined as holy acts or Christian acts or a life of service. Our desire to be godly, to avoid worldly lust, to be sober, to be righteous, all of those things are because of the grace that we've received that brings what? Salvation. Salvation is found in the grace of God. Salvation has never been found in how good I am or the works that I accomplish. Not by works, but by grace. The works, service, holiness, effort to avoid sinful things is a result of the grace that has saved me from those very sins. And again, here's why I believe that is important. The reason that's important, go back to our last couple of weeks' studies. The reason that order is important is the truth of the matter is, do I always deny ungodliness? No. Do I always avoid worldly lust? No. Am I always sober? And that's, by the way, not necessarily throwing one back, but sober-minded too. No. Am I always righteous? No. Am I always... So the point is, if I'm trying to earn holiness by how well I do those things, I'm always going to be what? I'm going to always be lacking. I'm going to be disappointed. I'm going to be discouraged. I'm going to be frustrated. Because I keep thinking about holiness being within me. I need to be more holy. No, what I need is to honor the grace of God more. If I have a heart and a desire to surrender every aspect of who I am to God because of the grace that saves me, then I'll desire to deny ungodliness. I'll want to avoid world. I'll want to accomplish the holiness that's found in God. We'll not earn holiness. Holiness is bestowed upon us through the grace of God. It's imputed. And we have to recognize why it is that we want to live and conduct our lives according to these characteristics and principles. And if the focus is, I've got to do these things in order to be right with God first, and then because I'm right with God, He's going to give me grace. I think that's backwards. I don't know that that's really what the Scriptures teach. The Scriptures teach we've been saved by grace through faith. Salvation is found, and as a result of the faith and commitment to the grace of God that saves us, then we make the choices and decisions of behaviors that are honorable in relationship to God. Now, here's the natural question maybe that comes from all that. Someone might say, well, Brian, then are you saying that I can be saved irregardless of whether I deny ungodliness, deny worldly lust, whether or not I live soberly, righteously? And that's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the reason we do those things is not to merit or earn the grace of God, but it is a result of. That, I believe, go back to what James said. We talked about it a couple of lessons ago. Remember, James said, faith without works is dead, being alone. Let a man show his faith by, right? Which came first? The faith did. The works are a result of an active, living faith. Holiness is a result of an active, living faith. And so the evidence of whether I have embraced the legitimacy of salvation by grace through faith, the evidence of whether I've embraced that or not in a genuine way is this holiness and conduct of life, not the other way around. Not, well, I did all these things, and so therefore I'm going to get grace. I did all those things, and because of the grace. And so, yeah, so salvation is tied to denying ungodly. Salvation is tied to avoiding worldly lust. Salvation is tied to avoiding the sins of the world. But which end of the question is it tied to? And that's really the kind of the point we need to grasp out of this. He said, looking for that blessed hope and the glorious appearing of the great God of our Savior, Jesus Christ. That's the intent and purpose we need to have. Seek the holiness of God because of the grace that saves us through faith. And that's the motivating factor. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, and here's the trick. And I talked to y'all a couple, lesson or two ago about light bulbs been going off in my head when I've been going through this study. And I think, Jim, I think sometimes we have to have conversations. Again, I keep going back to this. I apologize, but in the right order. So we might ask, well, so is it safe to say that if I don't do these things, I won't be saved? And the quick answer is yes. If I don't do these things, I won't be saved. Well, why is that? Well, it's because apparently I really haven't experienced the grace of God that brings salvation, because if I did and had any kind of real honest response to it, I would fulfill those things that are holy. And yet we have to be careful that in our effort to make sure that we're not just telling people, can we continue in sin that grace may abound? Because Paul said, God forbid, to that notion. So in order to avoid that concept sometimes, the idea that it really doesn't matter what you do because grace is going to save you anyway. See, that's the other extreme. What we sometimes make the mistake in doing is then we flip the equation again. And we start talking about how these things save us. And that instead of talking about them as a result of salvation that has been granted to us through the grace of God. And I just feel like it's a better conversation, more powerful conversation in some ways, to just make sure we always keep things in the proper order. Because the truth is, that's the way we think, though. We maybe in some ways behaviorally, the way we've studied the Bible, we've been kind of led to think that way. Here are the actions that save us, and here are the inactions that will cause us to lose salvation. And the grace and faith and justification and righteousness that's imputed never really becomes a conversation then. Because all we get done talking about is, did you do everything or did you not do everything? And I think you're on the same page there. Go ahead, Bob. Oh, I would agree. And again, that is kind of the concept that we falsely portray sometimes. That the idea of trying to be holy is about trying to be perfect in our behaviors, rather than a result of our desire to embrace the grace of God. And that's really just that small change of thinking when it comes to why I do what I do and why I practice what I practice. And we can make a mistake of presenting a message that gives the impression to people that their salvation, in some senses, rests first in their own choices, when that's not the case. Their salvation rests first in the decisions and choices that God made to extend His grace and mercy through His Son, and our faith in Him then leads us to fulfill the purposes that He gives. Yeah. Yeah. And it's the opportunity that every man has to come to the salvation of God. So God's completely free from all things evil. James chapter 1 verse 13 said what about God's character? Anybody recall? When he warned us in James 1, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. God's the complete opposite of all things evil. There's nothing evil about Him. There's no trait within Him that's evil. There's nothing about Him. And so the holiness of God is the absence of anything that is sinful or evil. Could we have accomplished that same level of holiness on our own? No, we can't accomplish that same levelness of holiness on our own. Go to Ephesians chapter 1, verse 7. So, our redemption, our cleansing, doesn't come because we've reached a certain level of purity that is equal to God's. We find it in whom we have redemption through His blood, the forgiveness of sins according to the riches of His grace. Our purity isn't founded in our own personal successes of how good we've become. Our purity is founded in the redemptive power of the blood of Jesus. That's how we find purity in the eyes of God. That's how we are viewed as holy, in some senses, in the eyes of God. And so holiness, if you go back to the worksheets for a minute, holiness it's both a state of a condition that I'm in, and also a commitment to behaviors and choices that I make. And how we react to the grace of God is holiness is the response to that. Thoughts or questions before I get into 1 Peter 1? Okay, so let's talk about this narrative now for a little while. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 13 beginning. Actually, let me back you up. I want to back you up. So I want you to notice something first. So he's speaking to whom he refers to in verse 2 of 1 Peter chapter 1. He speaks to an audience that he calls the elect. He says, elect according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through sanctification of the Spirit, unto obedience and sprinkling of the blood of Jesus Christ. Grace unto you and peace be multiplied. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which according to His abundant mercy hath begotten us again unto a lively hope by the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled that fadeth not away, reserved in heaven for you. So the audience that Peter is speaking to, he considers them the elect of God. He considers them blessed because the mercy of God allowed them to be begotten into a lively hope that they have. That's the audience. So think about that as you read what he says to them now, beginning in verse 13. So because you've been begotten unto a lively hope, because the grace of God has come, because you've received all these benefits, what should I do? Now because of that, wherefore? Anytime you see the word wherefore, what do you got to do first before you can understand what comes after the word? That's right. We got to do what we just did. We got to go backwards and see, okay, if he's given me a wherefore, he must have just given me a whole host of things to think about that created a state or condition or scenario that is going to affect what he's about to say. So because we found forgiveness in the mercy of God, because he's begotten us into a lively hope, because he's reserved us with his power unto the salvation of heaven, because of all these things, wherefore, this is how I respond to that. Gird up the loins of your mind. Be sober and hope to the end for the grace of God. Sorry, my eyes went crazy for me. For the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. So, this may sound like a strange kind of thing, but is there more than one form of the way God uses grace? And that's not really a trick question, but it is kind of a trick question. Here's my point. Did you notice what he talked about here when he said, and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought? In other words, the grace that he's speaking of in verse 13 has yet to be what? Yet to be given or experienced. What he's talking about in 13 is something that he says, Peter says, that you hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought unto you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. The unmerited favor of God doesn't start and end with a single nugget, if you will, of grace that brought salvation in its initial form to mankind. His grace reappears throughout the lives of men in various forms and fashion and for various purposes, including at the very end of all time, at the return and revelation of Jesus, there's a final grace, if you will, extended that allows for man to find salvation or experience salvation in Him. So because He's begotten us into a lively hope, gird up the loins of your mind. So what were they to do? Now, pull your questions out if you've got them, because I'm going to use them as we go. What were they to do with their minds? What's that mean, by the way, to gird them up? Yeah, right. Get your thinking right. Get your mind right. And they were to maintain soberness in their commitment. What did that mean in verse 13? So there's a sense of self-control, maybe a seriousness about the commitment. So you're going to wrap up, tie up the way you're thinking, get your mind right. Let it be sober. Let it think soberly and seriously about the benefits that God is bringing. And on what were they to fix their hope? Yeah, that there is a whole another realm of grace that is still to come. Think about that just for just half a moment. So we initially experience the grace where salvation can be found in my personal walk with God through faith, and I've experienced that. And I begin to experience the benefits that brings to my life. It starts to change me. I'm thinking differently about the world I live in now. I am behaving differently because the grace is teaching me to deny ungodliness and worldly lust and to start thinking soberly and righteously. My life is, and so all these benefits start to happen because I begin to honor and experience and appreciate the initial grace that comes through Jesus and the redemption of my sins. And then Peter says, guess what? There's more grace coming. The grace of God allowed you to be begotten unto a lively hope, and you haven't even seen all the grace of God yet. It's not even all here yet, he says. And so keep your mind sober. Keep your mind focused. Stay diligent in this relationship. Stay diligent in your effort to honor this grace that initially brings salvation to you, because when the revelation of Jesus happens and that ultimate end and final salvation comes, there's a grace that you haven't even experienced yet because of those benefits of becoming His child. And so as a result, verse 14, as obedient children, not fashioning yourselves according to the former lusts in your ignorance. Grace changes us. It has to. If I've really experienced genuinely the grace of God, it must change me. And so we go back to that question Jim asked just a little while ago. So if I don't do all those things, if I'm not sober-minded, if I don't live righteous, if I don't behave right, if I live in the worldly lust, if I do, am I going to be lost? And the answer is yes. Well, why? Is it because, in some senses, is it because you didn't do all those things? No. It's because you really didn't embrace the grace of God in the way you should have, because if you'd had, it would have changed you. It would have led you to do all of those things. Let me illustrate it to you this way. Has anybody ever said to you, made you a promise or a commitment that they didn't live up to? Where they said, here's what I'm going to do. Here's going to be the result of whatever. And then they don't do A, B, C, D, E, and F that they said they would. So would you say that they are going to receive the right? My point, friends, simply this: to receive the grace of God in honesty and genuinely leads me then to make the changes. And just as it would be dishonest for me to stand in front of you and look you in the eye and make a whole list of promises, or say, if you thank you for the gift that you've bestowed upon me. Let me rephrase my original analogy. Have you ever experienced somebody who was ungrateful, unappreciative, unthankful? And you saw it not necessarily just in their words, but you saw it in their actions, in the way they responded to the gift, the benefit, the blessing that you bestowed upon them. Their fruit, their response, their reaction to that gift told you whether they really appreciated it or not. The way I respond to the grace that saved me is evidence of whether I've really embraced it or not. Did I really embrace the grace that saves? Did I really embrace the grace through faith that brings salvation to man? Well, all you got to do is look at what happened afterwards to know the answer to that. Did it change him? Did it change me? Do I behave differently now? Do I think differently now? Am I girding up the loins of my mind? Am I leaving sin behind? Am I striving to honor the will and purposes of God? That's what he's challenging us to do here. Verse 14 asks, or the question asks, what kind of children were they to be to God in verse 14? Obedient. It's obedience, again, isn't in order to receive grace. Obedient is what children do as a response to the grace. By the way, that's not a foreign concept, right? We even understand that in our own family lives, right? And maybe that's a mistake. Maybe we make sometimes as parents is we flip and we start we reward, we offer our gifts, if you will, for obedience. And maybe now I'm in a whole other realm of teaching, so sorry. But then what we do then is we train them to think in their minds, well, okay, if I want something, then I'll be good, right? If I want something, then I'll be good. One of the greatest things I ever heard from somebody, a preacher, I don't even remember who it was, to be honest with you, I don't. But I just remember what they said. And they said, he was talking about behaviors in services and that kind of thing. He said, if you ever take a child out for bad behavior, don't give them a cookie. Because what did you just train them to think? That's right. Hey, if I act up right here and they're going to take me out, they're going to give me a cookie. Guess what I'm going to do? Right? Okay. So take that for whatever you want, whether you believe that or not, or however you want to use it, that's your business. My point is simply this. That's the warning we need to appreciate from a spiritual side of things. We don't obey so that God will give me the grace and gifts. We obey because He's already bestowed the grace and gifts. And if I haven't experienced that in the right ways, if I haven't viewed those things in the right ways, I'm again flipping the order. I'm conducting myself differently now because of what I've received through the grace of God. I'm not trying to be obedient in order to get to, because then again, I'm going to convince myself of one of two things possibly. I could convince myself on one side that I'm so good I deserve the gifts of God. Or, worse yet, I begin to convince myself, well, I can't do it. I can't be holy enough to receive the grace of God, so why be holy at all? Why bother? When you get them out of order, that's why it's important. No, you're right. You're not going to be holy enough to get the grace of God. You're not going to be obedient enough to get the grace of God. We're obedient and responsive, and we give up the former things that challenged us sinfully because of the grace. But as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation, because it is written, be ye holy, for I am holy. So who called them to that in verse 15? That's part of your questions, by the way. God did. And what impact was his identity to have on them? Yeah, if I'm your father and you're trying to respond to the grace and the love and the mercy that I'm bestowing upon you, then conduct yourself according to my holiness. Follow the pattern, an example that I've shown to you. He makes that statement in verse 16 because it is written. The question in question 7, if you're looking at your list, what was written? Remember, the Jewish scriptures that we call the Old Testament was the scripture of the first century church, right? When he says, because it is written, well, the only thing that they've got, quite potentially, is this letter that Peter writes and the Old Testament scriptures. What that illustrates to me is the holiness of God has been revealed since the Old Testament. The holiness of God is something that's been revealed and demonstrated and exemplified even under the Old Testament law. And so there should be an understanding of the holiness of God that has become the pattern by which we're living after Him. Notice now verse 17. If you call on the Father, who without respect of persons judgeth according to every man's work, pass the time of your sojourning here in fear. God is holy. I am His child. I'm responding to the grace that He's provided for me that allows for me to experience salvation. My reaction in response to that grace is to be an obedient child. And if I really call on Him as the Father, then understand the obligation that brings. If I've really embraced His grace, if I really view Him as my Father, if He is really my God, and there is none else, then recognize that He judgeth according to every man's work. Works are important. They absolutely affect one's salvation. They absolutely have an effect on my eternal state. It's just a matter of what order do they come in, and what position do they play in the scheme of things. The works have always been discussed as a result of faith within Scripture, not intended to receive something because of them, but as a result of something received. And the way, in some senses, we relinquish the grace of God is to be unchanged by it and to not honor Him as the Father. And if we do such, then I don't know how anyone could expect to receive any kind of gift or benefit from a Father that they've rebelled against, rejected, turned aside from, ignored, and refused to allow His holiness to reign in their lives as well. Sure. I mean, it's a resulting benefit that comes from the grace of God. Absolutely. Any other thoughts? I'll pause for a minute. So then what was, back to your questions, I want to just skip them because I know some of you worked through them. So if we answered question 8, question 9, what motivates us to behave in the fear of reverence? Yeah, so, because He's going to judge every man according to, so I'm going to sojourn here in fear. I'm going to balance. In other words, I'm not going to let the grace of God begin to make me think that, oh, what's the matter what I do? I already got the grace. I already received it, so it doesn't matter what I do from this point forward. Well, James warns about that. Peter warns about that. It wasn't what Paul intended. He said in chapter 6 of Romans, that's not what I'm trying to say. It is important. It's absolutely vital in the process. And the warnings are still true. Just because we make sure we get them in the right order doesn't necessarily make the warnings any less powerful. For as much as you know that you were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold from your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers. So what's moving or motivating me to behave in the proper ways? Well, the grace was revealed through the blood of Jesus. The sacrifice, the redemption that comes not by corruptible things. You and I weren't purchased with gold and silver. We weren't provided for through physical temporary means. God brought salvation. He ushers in the age of His grace through faith, through the very death and blood of His Son. It should be a more motivating reason as to why I conduct myself the way I do. Not with those traditional thoughts of their forefathers, but by the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. That was the price that was paid in order to bring all of these benefits to us, who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you. So, pause for a moment. So if the coming of Jesus and the redemption that would be brought through His blood and the purchase that He was willing to make through that blood, all those things that we could talk about, if they were designed, ordained, purposed before the foundations of the world were even set in order, then God's intention of bringing grace by salvation by grace through faith was God's intention before the foundations of the world. It wasn't an afterthought. It wasn't God kind of making up a plan as He went to try to determine how it was. The idea or concept of salvation by grace through faith was understood in the mind of God, because the plan that would bring it into existence through the blood of Jesus was understood by the mind of God before the world was even created. How powerful was that? At least it should be. When I live my life according to the benefits and blessings that come from the grace of God, I'm rendering my life over to a purpose and plan that was here before we were here, before the world was here. And God's intents and purposes and manifestations of His salvation, who by Him do believe in God that raised Him up from the dead and gave Him glory, that your faith and hope might be in God. My faith and hope is not in Brian. It's not in me. Peter comes right back to the same sentiment we have been saying over and over and over again in our study. It doesn't come back to me. It always goes back to God. And my ability to find salvation, my hope, my anchor, everything about my eternal relationship to God, it's all comes back to Him. I don't have any hope that I can be wholly absent of God. I don't have any hope that I'm a child of His, absent of the Father and the holiness that He exemplifies. I don't have any hope. I don't have the lively hope that the first part of the chapter talked about. It doesn't exist in my life. Separate and apart from God. So quit trying to be holy in order to, and start being holy because of. That's the point. In the simplest of terms, that's the point. Be holy because of, not be holy in order to. And I think that slight change of thinking should be a greater motivator to us. Because we'll use all the excuses otherwise, right? We'll talk about, well, I'm imperfect and I can't do it and all that kind of stuff. Well, all that stuff kicks in. If it's in order to, then all that mindset kicks in and I just walk away. Because I just convinced myself it can't be done. But when you put God in the proper order, sure, it can't be done if I'm first, but it can be imputed and it can be educated and it can be taught and it can be led by the Spirit and it can have all those things happening if it's on the other side in order to bring benefit to us. If then, right, right, and you can't even once it's available. And I think, Jim, that's kind of the thought we got to make sure we understand is it's not just the idea that we didn't deserve it to begin with. We don't ever deserve it. There's never a point in time where I could say, because I bring so much value to God, that I deserve His grace. It will never happen. I just thank Him for the benefits that it brings and that He offers to me. Well, I think definitely there's not anything hidden in terms of what God knew, in some senses expected from man before the foundation. You don't make a plan to save man before the foundations of the world if you didn't know He was going to need it to begin with. So absolutely, God understood what the needs of man would be before man even existed. So in our last few minutes, the writer of the workbook, let me go back to it for a moment here. He makes this statement in this paragraph where he says, no one is holy by what? By accident. Right? You don't just stumble across it. In other words, it takes some energy, some honesty, some effort on our part. And it's not necessarily always convenient. It doesn't happen by accident. It's not always easy. It's not always the most convenient choice. I'll be honest. I struggle with trying to find a balance between making certain aspects and functions, if you will, of the Lord's body convenient without leading people's personal religious convictions to become convenient. What I mean by that is we turned the heat on, right? We turned the heat on tonight so you'd have a relatively comfortable place. Years and years and years and years ago, we dumped the solid wooden pews, put these nice cushion things in here, right? We have done lots of things. We try to do scheduling so that it makes it as convenient in some senses as possible for people to find ways to engage and involve themselves in the worship and purposes of God. You've heard me say, probably in times past, as I've researched this in the past, we even do that. That's exactly why there are two services on Sunday, by the way. The reason why there are two services on Sunday is because when the Industrial Revolution came on the scene, we went away from being a farm agricultural society. When we were a farming agricultural society, predominantly every church had one service. You know why? Because they had to get up and milk the cows and do all the farming work. Then they would come, right? And their means of travel was very complicated. And so they would come. And then the Industrial Revolution came on the scene. When factories and plants and things like that were being built, what happened? What kind of work did they start doing? Shift work. Now these plants and factories need crews 24/7, and the church needed an opportunity to be able to can be convenient for all members, including those who were working in those factories at different hours, to be able to assemble. Voila, the second service. That's where it came from. It was a matter of convenience. And rightly so. Okay? My point is, rightly so. There were folks who were going to be neglected in some senses within the worship and challenged. And so we work to make it convenient. I'm making a very basic point here with you. We do all kinds of things to make it as easy as possible for people to serve the Lord. But it can become a mistake because we can make it so convenient and easy that people become accustomed to it that way and don't want to do the hard things. And not everything about being holy is easy. Not everything about following the example of God's holiness comes easily. Sacrifice, difficult choices and decisions, behaviors that have to be changed, sinful things that have to be left behind in my life, righteousness that needs to be pursued. There are lots of things that we can do to make certain elements as convenient as possible, but it's not all going to be that way. And if we've trained our mind to think, well, I'll do all things religious as long as it's easy and convenient, then we'll miss the mark when it comes to holiness. Because holiness is not always going to be easy and convenient. But if I've really been moved by the grace of God, and I've really been moved by the fact that He's begotten me unto a lively hope, and if I'm really moved through faith and conviction in my Creator for what He's blessed and benefited me in, then I'm willing to do hard things. And what has amazed me, and a lot of times over the years, anecdotally, has been, I know a lot of people that have done some amazingly hard things to bring personal benefit, but ask them to do it for spiritual benefit, and there's a resistance. And I've always wondered about that. Because it's obvious it's not an effort issue. They've already illustrated a willingness and ability. The kinds of sacrifices we make on all kinds of other fronts, and we do it all the time. Make sacrifices for all kinds of fronts and make things we want to accomplish or do. And so if we're really committed to the faith and grace that God's bestowed upon us, then we're really going to commit ourselves to the holiness that God exemplifies before us. I'll briefly come back. We're going to be off from this class till next Wednesday. And so we'll come back to this briefly, but go ahead and prep lesson 8 for next Wednesday night as well.